Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 8, which is the Introduction to Contract Law. We're actually going to be spending a variety of chapters in contract law because there's many facets to understanding how an agreement is forged from beginning to its ultimate conclusion or completion. So in this chapter, which is a fairly brief chapter, we're looking at why and how contract law has developed. We'll talk about what a contract is. We'll talk about its required elements. There are some fundamental things that every contract must have and in order to have a binding agreement. We'll talk about sources of contract law, and then near the end of the chapter, we talk about how contracts are classified. So there's different categories of how we kind of, compartmentalize the different types of agreements that exist. So in terms of to understand like why we have a contract just evidences an agreement between two parties, or it could be among three or more parties. And the intent of the contract guides that relationship, so it provides a clear, detailed explanation of what is expected of each of the parties throughout the life of this agreement. The agreement could be a single transaction, so like I buy something from you as a single time event, and then you deliver it as agreed, you're compensated, I receive what was negotiated over, and then that contract is over, and we may never do business together again. Contracts can also be evidencing a relationship that could span months or years even. Think of a home mortgage, because the mortgage itself is a contract. And that agreement lives for, anywhere from 20 to 30 years in many cases. And so that's a very long duration as a type of an agreement. So, and the purpose behind evidencing it in writing is that, sometimes if it was just verbal, parties may forget, whether it's selective memory, or they may just genuinely misunderstand or forget what they were expected to do at different intervals in the agreement. But if it's written, it's clearly documented, hopefully, then it's clear when parties are supposed to act and in what way. So this contract is a binding agreement, between two or among maybe three or more parties. Essentially, there are three bedrock things that you have to have. There has to be a clear offer expressed. So I'm offering to you to sell to you, fill in the blank, a product, a service, whatever it is. I'm offering to sell that to you. And so that's the offer. The law doesn't recognize clairvoyance or telepathy, and so it has to be very clear and unequivocal that an offer is being conveyed. At that point, whoever hears the offer, then they can either accept, and so we're on our way to a contract. We're not quite there yet, but we're on our way if someone accepts. It could be rejected. I could offer to you, I could say, look, I'm selling my car, and I'm, the selling price is $30,000, and you may be like, yeah, no thanks, and then you just shut me down, and so that would be a rejection, and of course, no contract there. So if you accept, then that's the second kind of like prong of what is required for a contract. You have to have an offer, you have to have an acceptance, and then you also have to have what is called consideration. So consideration is this bargain for exchange that each side gives up in order to get something in return. If you have these three things, and we're also, the presumption is that everyone has contractual capacity and that what you're contracting is legal and it's not illegal. If you satisfy these elements, then you have a binding contract. So I always like to try and relate things so that it's easier to understand from a student's perspective. And I think most, if not all of us, have been to a grocery store. So we walk into a grocery store and we see all the stuff that's on the shelf. Everything on the shelf is an offer. Whether it's a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, a bunch of bananas, whatever it is. All of those things are an offer. As soon as we pick it up and we take whatever we pick up to the cash register, when we do that, that is acknowledging acceptance. So we have an offer, we have an acceptance. We don't have a completed contract yet because I could change my mind. I usually don't, but I always have the bad luck of being behind someone who at the last minute wants to add something to their order, or they want to like return something. And so I'm like waiting there, that's a different story. Anyway, so that's acceptance. Consideration occurs, it's a simultaneous event at the grocery store. The checkout person, he or she rings up your groceries, it gets bagged while all this is happening, and then you are preparing the payment process. So once everything is correctly kind of price marked and then put in your bag, the cashier, he or she tells you this is the amount, and then you take care of the consideration, which is legal tender. So you pay by cash, you pay by check, you pay by debit or credit card, traveler's checks, whatever it is. And as soon as they accept your form of payment, then at that point you're handed your groceries and a receipt, and the contract is satisfied and it's over at that point. And so that is a very simple type of contractual arrangement that occurs. So when we think of consideration, remember it's both sides want to give up something that they would rather have in exchange. So if I'm the grocery store, I don't want inventory, I want cash. And if I'm a customer, I can't eat cash, I need food. And so what I want is, here's some money, give me some food, please. So that's the consideration aspect of this transaction. Each side gives up something in order to get something in exchange. Think of a more complicated transaction. Let's say that you decide to go to a car dealership this weekend and you want to purchase a brand new car. So it's like, okay, I want to buy a car. If you have all the cash, and you can just say, here's a check for the full amount, then okay, that's a simple transaction. But most people don't have that kind of cash, and so you get it financed. And so when you get a car financed, it's over a period of a number of months of payments. It could be 48 months, 60 months, 72 months, or longer. And so every time you make a payment, that is adding to your consideration for that overall contract. When you get to the end of the term, let's say it's a 60-month auto finance loan. Once you make your 60th payment, the contract has been completed at that point. So contracts can be created and can be satisfied in a matter of minutes at a grocery store, or it could take a matter of years if you're trying to buy a car or maybe land or a home or something that you're financing. So everything is very specific as to what the agreement entails to kind of dictate, well, what are the terms, how long is this going to last, and so on. But overall, just remember, at least for this chapter, we'll get into more details in future chapters, but for this chapter, you have to have an offer, you have to have consideration, and you have to have an acceptance. And if you have those things, plus people have capacity, which we'll talk about capacity next week, and if it's for a lawful purpose, then we have a binding agreement at that point. We can categorize or divide up contracts in different levels or different ways. And so one level of distinction is we have what are known as formal contracts and informal contracts. Formal contracts usually require like some kind of seal. There are contracts of record. There could be negotiable instruments. There are particular formalities that are required for those types of agreements. If any of you have ever purchased real property, there is a sequence of procedures you have to follow. It's not a very casual thing. It's a very formal process. Informal contracts is basically anything that's not formal. So, we lump in a lot of transactions that are just deemed to be informal. You can also have what are called express contracts versus implied contracts. So an express contract is either verbal or written. I advise strongly against verbal contracts just because of the lack of writing. Some contracts we'll learn next week have to be in writing to satisfy what is called statute of frauds, but we'll get to that then. But you can have a verbal agreement, suffice to say for our purposes this week. So those would be express, verbal and written. Implied contracts are where the law will pretend a contract existed in order to avoid what is called unjust enrichment. And at the end of this chapter, I have a problem that we'll kind of discuss, and it highlights how we have to pretend a contract existed, otherwise unjust enrichment would occur. And we really don't like to have someone unjustly benefit at the expense of another party. So, so we'll put a pin in this idea of like an implied contract, and we'll come back to it. The other kind of like classification is this continuum of like valid, voidable, and void. So valid are what most contracts are. They're binding and they're fully enforceable. So if I get a car financed and then I stop making payments, I'm in breach. And then, the car can be repossessed. If I go to the grocery store and I select all these groceries and I pay for them, then I'm entitled to the consideration or the groceries that I purchased. That is a valid contract in both cases. Voidable is where we're going to allow, because of public policy reasons, one of the parties to opt out of the contract. So it's kind of like backing out, and you can do so without any penalty. So the best example there is if you're dealing in a contract with a minor, so someone under the age of 18. If you're selling to a minor, let's say you're Macy's and you're selling a dress for prom, you run the risk of that minor disavowing the contract and wanting to return the consideration, even though maybe they've worn it to prom. At that point, that would be a voidable transaction. Only necessaries can be enforced against a minor. So like if it's medical care, if it's like shelter and food, there's insurance policies are another kind of odd example. But those are instances where even if you're under 18, we can still compel you to satisfy the contract. But anything else that's not a necessary, and like, let's say a dress or clothing, electronics, those are not necessaries. And so if a teenager wants to return them before they turn 18, a minor, I should say, not a teenager, but a minor, then there's nothing that store can do. They have to honor the refund request, even if the item in question has been used and or damaged. So, and the policy rationale behind that, and maybe you could debate that in today's world, because I think younger people are more savvy than my generation and kind of going backward in time. But the idea is that adults can sometimes take advantage of minors in a contractual sense, and we don't want individuals under the age of 18 to kind of suffer from a bad deal, and so we give them an out as long as it's not a necessary. The final category or class there is void, and in this case, per se, the underlying transaction is void, and even if the parties want to continue with it, they're not able to. One of the best cases for a void transaction is if you've ever known anyone that has a guardianship over them. Usually it's elderly or someone who's suffering from like a severe mental or physical impairment. And so another person gets a guardianship over that person. And it's a big deal in terms of legal proceedings, because you're basically stripping away the ability of someone to make decisions for themselves. So let's say it's, you have an elderly grandparent who maybe suffers from dementia. And so there's a guardian over them, could be a child, a sibling, whoever. And so if the person who has a guardianship over them, if they somehow enter into a contract, that contract is just per se void. The guardian is the only one that can enter into contracts for who they are guarding over. So that's one of the best examples that I've encountered in my travels, where per se that is void. It's an otherwise valid contract. Had it just been with two different parties, where neither of them have a guardianship over another person, just two regular adults, so to say, then that would be completely a valid enforceable contract, but for that restriction. Some other types of contracts, before I get to the unjust enrichment discussion, there are option contracts and then rights of first refusal. So an option contract is essentially, it's a contract where you're agreeing to possibly enter into another contract at a future date. I've seen this in many cases with like lease or rent with option to purchase. And so, sometimes, let's say you're trying to sell your house, and let's say the market just isn't moving right now. So you rent it out, and who you rent it to, you're like, look, I'm going to rent it to you for this amount. But if you ever decide you want to purchase it, I'll give you, like a rent with option to buy. And it can either be exercised or not by the tenant. If they never exercise it, there's no contract for sale that springs to life. If they do decide to, then they have a certain time period. It could be anywhere from like 2 to 4 years, or what you agree to. Then at that point they exercise that option, and a second contract springs into being. The other type of contract is right of first refusal, which again is a contract. And that's where you are getting another party to agree to come to you first when they decide to sell something. Another land example that I have seen here is it could be adjacent property owners, and not so much like in a subdivision, because that's not usually, this doesn't happen in a subdivision situation. It's in more rural areas where you own like larger tracts of land, 10, 20, 30 acres or more. And you might have neighboring property, and the neighbor might come to you and say, look, if you ever decide to sell your property, I'd like to have right of first refusal. I'll pay fair market value for it, but I just would like to obligate you to come to me first. And so if you agree to that, and you have offer acceptance consideration, that's fine. Then when you do decide to sell, you go to your neighbor, and then your neighbor can either purchase it for whatever the fair market value is, or if they say, look, I'm out of money right now, I pass, and then you can sell it to anybody else. So that's a right of first refusal. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit today. So in quasi contracts, or this idea of unjust enrichment, what we're looking for is a situation where a benefit is conferred on someone. They didn't earn that benefit, and an innocent party is suffering because of that benefit, and unjust enrichment would result if we didn't correct the situation. And so, this is a unique area of the law that has been kind of carved out in the interest of just overall like justice or equity of the transaction. And so the best example is this case here, involving Hallman, two parties, one named Allman, the other one Partipolo. And they were adjacent landowners. And so one neighbor, they did some improvements on their land. And if any of you are homeowners, if you do anything on your property, you have to get permits. And as soon as you finish, upgrading your property, the county tax assessor is going to say, well, this is worth more money now, so your taxes have increased. Okay, fine. So Hallman made these improvements on his land. At the county assessor's office, they counted the improvements towards Partipolo's land, which is the neighboring property. And so this went on for several years. Partipolo's taxes went up on his property. He didn't really realize it, though. So he just kept paying it for a few years. He eventually discovered the error. And, he, basically said, this isn't right. I mean, I'm not paying this. And so, Hallman went to, Partipolo, went to Hallman and said, look, I need you to pay for this. And, Hallman basically was saying, I didn't make the mistake. I'm not paying for this. So Partipolo goes to City Hall and, to the county assessor's office and explains the mistake. And so City Hall fixes it going forward. But what they do not do is refund him his money. Because City Hall is basically saying, we don't have your tax money from 2 or 3 years ago. That money was spent on firefighters, police, and schools. So that money's gone. And so we'll fix it going forward, but for all the back stuff, you got to talk to your neighbor. So, okay, great. Partipolo's like, I've already talked to my neighbor, and I know where I'm going to get with this, and nowhere, basically. So what Partipolo has to do is either eat that cost, which no one wants to do that, or you have to sue your neighbor, because your neighbor doesn't voluntarily just say, look, tell me what I owe you and I'll pay it. So you go to court and you file a cause of action. You have to have a theory of your case of what you're alleging. You just can't say this person owes me money. There has to be a rational and legal argument you're making. So the argument here is that, you're basically, as Partipolo, the plaintiff, you're asking the judge, you're saying, Your Honor, because of unjust enrichment, for 3 years, Hallman benefited by me paying his additional property tax amount. And what I'm asking the court now is to say, let's pretend we had a contract and that I paid this difference for 3 years, and now the 3 years is up, and now Hallman owes me that 3 years plus interest for those years that I paid the additional property tax that should have been levied on his property. Okay, now, even though it's a complete legal fiction, we've got a way to have, Partipolo recover. Otherwise, Partipolo would be out of luck because the county isn't going to refund him his money. The county isn't going to give him a credit for going forward. And the county isn't going to, apply a surcharge to Hallman's property and then refund that to Partipolo. They're not going to do that. They'll fix the mistake, but that's it. So we have to have this mechanism, and that mechanism is unjust enrichment. And so remember, in terms of what has to happen, the elements are there has to be a benefit that's conferred on a defendant, Hallman got a benefit. Hallman knew of the benefit, and in this case, let's say Hallman didn't know at all. We're going to pretend constructively that Hallman should have known, because property taxes are public record. They're not secret, and so everybody, including the property owner, can look up their property taxes. And if you make improvements on your property, you should look to see, well, how much is this going to cost me going forward, because the value of my land is going to increase. And so even if he didn't do that, and he can claim ignorance, we're going to pretend that he should have known, even if he didn't know. And then the last element is that it would be unjust if we allowed the defendant, Hallman, to retain the benefit without payment or compensation to the plaintiff, which is Partipolo. So anyway, long story short, this is an area of the law where we're trying to kind of right a wrong that occurs. And so in the interest of justice, in the interest of equity, like an equitable argument, that's how we kind of fix these unique situations as they arise. So anyway, I hope that helps. We're going to be getting into contracts in a lot more detail over the next 3 weeks. So kind of like a preview of things to come, so to speak. If you have questions on anything that we covered today, please feel free to message me anytime, call, text, email, and I'll be more than happy to get back with you as soon as possible. Otherwise, I hope each of you have a good, safe, and productive week, and I'll be chatting with you all very soon and online. So have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.